Good afternoon and welcome to the Dibble Institute's October webinar. I'm Kay Reed, I'm the Executive Director of the Dibble Institute, and I'm thrilled to have you here with us. We actually counted up, and this is our 113th, count that 113 webinar. So we're super excited to have you here. We're super excited to have Dr. Alamillo join us. So a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. First off, if you can't hear us, you can, put something in the chat, but I always write back and say, it's probably your computer, sorry. So you might log back in, log out, log back in, or in the email, the invitation we sent you is a phone-in number. So if you need to phone in, no worries, no harm, that's all good. Number two, we will be archiving this webinar and sending it out, sending out a notice to all of you. And if you also want a certificate of completion, we will send that out automatically to everyone who's here today. So a few things, one more thing. If you would, on your control panel, you have a little hand. So if you would all find your little hand and tell me if this is your very first webinar, if you've missed the other 112 and you're here today for the first time, would you please raise your hand? I'd like to see how many new people there are. Oh, good. Okay, about 25% of you are new, so welcome. And for those of you who've been to one or 112 of our other webinars, they're every second Wednesday at 1 o'clock, so at 1 Pacific. So feel free to join us moving forward. All righty, so Esther is our engineer today. So Esther, would you move us to the next slide, please? The Dibble Institute, for those of 25% of you who are new, was founded by Charlie and Helen Dibble. Charlie was an engineer by trade, a straight ahead, fix it kind of guy. And when he retired, he did a lot of youth work, and he saw in his young friends how their relationships or their lack of confidence in their intimate relationships or their parents' relationships would change the trajectory of their lives. And Charlie, not being one to shy away from big issues, big challenges, said, let me work on this. So he called the leading researchers of the day, this was in the mid-'80s, and came away with a long list of what people were understanding about making for long-lasting, healthy, safe, and stable families and relationships. And when he said to them, but what are you doing to reach young people? They were like, well, not in our, they're too hard to reach. That's difficult. So Charlie took that on, and today, Esther, the next slide, we have the Dibble Institute. We've been around for about, depending on how you count, about 22 years incorporated, but we were doing a little work before that. And now we have reach throughout the country. So let me explain reach. The Dibble Institute is a national independent nonprofit organization. There's nobody behind the screen, behind us, it's just us. And we're not direct service providers. We are really grateful to all of you who use our materials with youth in your community. You might use them in a school, you might use them in a correctional setting, you might use them after school, you might use them in a church. And that's what I mean. Our reach means your reach and all the good work you're doing. And we're counting up right now what we did in this current fiscal year, but last fiscal year, very conservatively, again, thank you. We reached over 115,000 young people, which is huge. And we are really grateful for your help in doing that. Next slide. So what we do all day long is help empower people, young people, to build healthy and safe, happy, intimate relationships. Could be their love lives, could be an intimate relationship with a family member. There's all kinds of intimate relationships, but we really focus on the romantic. And what we found in our research is that when you help young people get smart about their love lives, then lots of good changes happen. Sexual activity changes, mental health increases, violence decreases. So it's an intervention that seems very simple, but actually pulls quite a few levers and pulls them significantly. And you are welcome to go to our website We have a whole evaluation tab with all the work that's been done on our programs. But we're in this, all the levers you need to pull for young people. There's thousands, and we can help you pull this one, their intimate relationships. So we're really happy to do that. All right, Esther. So some of our core values, we're big fans of research. Charlie Dibble got us started on taking research and translating that into practical teaching tools. So all of our programs are based on research. And early on, our board wanted us to do evaluations of all our programs. And even though I protested at the time, and I'm sorry I did, because finally I gave in. And as I said, it's really astonishing all the good things that happen when you help young people in this one phase. Because if you're teaching them communication skills, setting expectations, building agency, you're helping them in a variety of areas of their lives. So the other part about research is that it changes. I was just talking with Julia about science, and science is never settled. We're just waiting for the next study to come out. So in our case, there were findings 20 years ago about cohabitation and how it was pretty much universally a bad thing to do, would not create safe and stable, healthy families in the future. And now we're finding, well, that's not actually correct. There's, it's much more nuanced than that. We have cohabitation that's very intentional and people are very committed and they're upfront versus cohabitation where people slide. By the way, we're having Scott Stanley, who's Dr. Stanley from University of Denver, speak on that sometime in 2023, I think February of 2023. Anyway, we're big fans of research, so you just need to know that. All right, next slide. We're also big fans of safe, stable, and nurturing families. I've said that like a zillion times this morning or just so far. And what I mean by that is, there's people who choose to be married, there's people who choose to cohabitate, there's people who choose or just sometimes but due to circumstances, being single parents. And all of those places, you can create safe, stable, and nurturing, healthy families. What's hard on kids, and the reason I'm in this game, is the outcomes for children based on family formation is when things are unstable, where there's lots of drama, where there's lots of transitions that aren't well thought out. And so we hope and we see in our materials that we can help young people start, and nobody wants to lead a chaotic life. I mean, maybe there are some people, maybe there's some people who love chaos, but most people want to live a safe, stable, and healthy family life. So we really help young people achieve their own goals and dreams, regardless of what legal arrangement the parents have. Alrighty, next slide. And finally, we think relationship education is for absolutely everyone. Doesn't matter your age, doesn't matter your marital status, doesn't matter your ethnicity or racial background or your financial background, your economic circumstances. We all can get smarter about our relationships. And so we create materials that are intentionally inclusive of all young people, of all, and then people can put their own cultural things on top of that. We're super happy with that. But we don't think that relationship education is only for one population. It's for like everybody. Just a tip here. It's one of my favorite wedding gifts to give, or even an engagement gift or a pre-engagement gift is a relationship education class. Anyway, anyway, not on topic. All righty, next. So today we have Dr. Julia Alamillo from Mathematica joining us. She is a senior researcher and has background in studying marriage and demography. She and I just chit-chatted. She has her PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's currently the director. She's all over the Federal Administration for Children and Families, Healthy Relationships and Marriage, and Responsible Fatherhood Programming. So she's the director of the Framing Project. She's going to go into these in more detail, which really looks at the research side and what we know and what we don't know, what are the gaps, what are the priorities. She's also leading the Streams Project to evaluate the effectiveness in relationship education for youth in high schools. She studied one of our programs down in Georgia. And she has there's a new report out as part of the framing project on understanding the youth relationship programs that I thought would be super interesting for the people in the Dibble sphere. So without further ado, Julia, you can pop back on. There she is.
All right.
Thank you so much. And oh, I know what I meant to say. Sorry, last thing. If you have a question, please just put it in the question box, or if you have a chat. The chat doesn't work on as you would expect. So if you want to communicate with us on the other side, just put it into the question box. All righty. Thanks, Julia.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kay, for that nice introduction. And I'm so pleased to be joining all of you today to share some recent work that we did to synthesize the state of the evidence on healthy relationship programs for youth. As Kay alluded to, mentioned, I am a sociologist and also a demographer by training. In graduate school, most of my work focused on understanding the effects of family structure and parenting behaviors on children's well-being. However, since coming to Mathematica a little over 7 years ago, I've spent a lot of time thinking about healthy relationship programs for youth and young people and how to make these programs even better so that more young people can benefit from them. Next slide. Before I get started here, I'd like to take a minute to thank the people and agencies that funded this work. The study I'm going to present on today was conducted as part of an ongoing project that is funded by the Office of Family Assistance within the Administration for Children and Families at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, or OPRE, manages the project. In particular, we have been managed by 3 wonderful project officers within OPRE, Jessie Coe, Samantha Alanga-Sacra, and Kriti Jain. Next slide. So what's on the agenda for today? I'm going to begin by providing a little bit of background on the project that this study is a part of. Kay mentioned already, this is called the Framing Research Project. After that, I'll describe the focus of the particular study I'm here to discuss today, which aimed to synthesize the impact literature on healthy relationship programs for youth. I'll provide some background on healthy relationship programs for youth. In the federal space, these programs are often called Healthy Marriage and Relationship Education Programs, or HMRE programs. Some of you may be very familiar with that acronym, and I'm going to use it quite a bit throughout the presentation today. After this, I'll give a quick tutorial on evidence and gaps maps, which are the tool we use to help us review and synthesize the impact literature on HMRE programs. Next, I'll describe the studies that we reviewed, and I'll present findings from our evidence and gaps map. And finally, I'll discuss the implications of our findings for future research, as well as some implications for programs. And I should note, I'm happy to take questions at any times throughout the presentation. There'll also be time at the end to ask questions. I don't know that I'm sophisticated enough to see the question, so I'm going to count on Kay to jump in. If you submit questions via the chat, Kay can chime in with those. And then also, I should mention that everything I'm going to present today is also available in a report that's published on OPRE's website. I have a link to that report on the last slide, but I think it's also included as a handout in the webinar platform, so you can access it that way as well. All right, next slide. All right, so as was already mentioned, this work was conducted as part of the federally sponsored Framing Research Project, which stands for Fatherhood, Relationships, and Marriage, Illuminating the Next Generation of Research. The project began in 2018 and runs through September of 2023 and is being conducted jointly by staff at Mathematica, where I work, and Public Strategies. The purpose of the project is to provide ACF with information to support the development of its learning agenda for healthy marriage and relationship education programming, as well as responsible fatherhood programming, or RF programming for short. The goal of ACF's learning agenda is to improve program performance by applying existing evidence about what works, generating new knowledge, and testing new approaches for program delivery. Next slide. To identify gaps in the knowledge base about HMRE and RF programs, as well as new research directions for ACF, we on the Framing Research Project are conducting several activities. These include reviewing the literature on HMRE and RF programs, collecting lots of input and expertise from researchers, program practitioners, program developers, and others, and collecting guidance from ACF on agency priorities. And then we're sharing this information by producing several things, including summary briefs of meetings with experts, which we call technical work group meetings, practice and research briefs, evidence and gaps maps, and longer white papers. And all of these products are available to the public, and you can find them on ACF's website. They have a web page for the Framing Research Project where all of this is located. Next slide. All right, so for this particular piece of the project, Mathematica was tasked with creating an evidence and gaps map to summarize the impact literature on healthy relationship programs for youth. Our goal with this analysis was to address two research questions. First, what do we know about the effectiveness of HMRE programs for youth at improving young people's romantic relationship attitudes, skills, behaviors, and experiences, as well as other related outcomes? And second, what do we know about the effectiveness of these programs in the short term versus the longer term? Next slide. All right, so taking a step back here, what exactly are HMRE programs for youth? Given that we're at a webinar sponsored by Dibble, I'm assuming most of you are very familiar with these programs, and many of you in the audience are probably even involved in the development and delivery of these programs. However, some of you may not be aware of the history of healthy marriage and relationship education programs. So since the mid-2000s, the federal government has authorized funding to support healthy marriage initiatives, including HMRE programs for youth. These programs are funded by the Office of Family Assistance within the Administration for Children and Families, ACF. And the programs offer a broad range of relationship education services for people of different ages. For example, some programs are designed for adult couples and address topics like how to build intimacy and trust with a romantic partner. Other programs, like the ones I'll be talking about today, are designed for teens and young adults who may not have much personal experience with romantic relationships yet. In 2020, OFA allocated separate funding to youth and adult HMRE programs for the first time. So there was a separate funding stream for each of those buckets of programs. And with the 2020 funding, OFA awarded more than $24 million to programs serving high school age youth and young adults between ages 18 and 24. Next slide. So what do HMRE programs for youth cover? These programs aim to help teens and young adults improve their relationship skills, attitudes, and behaviors in order to form healthy relationships in adolescence and adulthood. Most of these programs feature a structured curriculum, such as those distributed by the Dibble Institute. For example, Relationship Smarts Plus and Love Notes are two of the more commonly used curricula among these programs. The programs tend to have some common themes. For instance, most of the programs address topics like identifying personal values, understanding the characteristics of healthy relationships, and improving communication and conflict management skills. Some, but not all of the curricula also cover topics such as reducing risky sexual behavior and teen pregnancy, and preparing teens for college and a future career. Next slide. So most HMRE programs for youth are delivered in high schools in a class during the regular school day, such as health or family and consumer sciences. The programs tend to be delivered by facilitators who work for an outside organization and come into the classroom to deliver the program, or sometimes by classroom teachers who have been trained to deliver the programs themselves. And even though HMRE programs are most commonly delivered in high schools, they are also sometimes delivered after school or in other community settings, such as places of worship, community centers, libraries, etc. Most of the commonly used HMRE curricula consist of around 10 to 15 lessons, and each lesson lasting somewhere in the realm of like 60 to 90 minutes. However, the length of programs as a whole can vary quite a bit. For example, some programs may offer lessons once a week over the course of a semester or a school year, whereas other programs may offer lessons every day in a more condensed format for like 1 to 2 weeks. Next slide. All right. So now that I've provided some background on what HMRE programs for youth offer, let's transition to discussing our review of the evidence base for these programs. To synthesize what we know about the effectiveness of HMRE programs for youth, my colleagues and I created something called an evidence and gaps map. An evidence and gaps map is a grid or matrix that presents what is and is not known about the evidence on a given topic. Basically, it's a way of visually depicting findings from a systematic review of the impact literature on a given topic. Like any systematic review, evidence and gaps maps should have a systematic search strategy, clear criteria for including or excluding studies from the review, and they should report on all eligible studies. Next slide. Evidence and gaps maps are often used to show whether different sorts of interventions impact different outcomes. So, for example, we could use an evidence and gaps map to synthesize the literature on, say, different sorts of interventions for expecting parents. In this case, in the rows, we could include different types of interventions, such as in-person classes at a hospital, virtual classes that parents can take at home, programs targeted specifically to dads, sending literature home with moms after their prenatal appointments, etc. And in the columns, we would include different types of outcomes, such as parents' level of confidence before the baby arrives, parents' level of stress after the baby arrives, how involved fathers are with their newborns, etc. And then finally, in the cells, we would document whether a particular intervention found an impact on a particular outcome. And when the evidence and gaps map is complete, we could look at all of the cells to see which interventions impact lots of outcomes and which interventions have less evidence of impacts. So that's one way an evidence and gaps map can be used, but it's not the only way you can construct them. A map could also show how evidence for one type of program or intervention varies based on study design. So this is actually what we did for our evidence and gaps map. We only examined one type of program, HMRE programs for youth, but we considered a variety of outcomes to determine which outcomes had the strongest evidence of impacts. And we also considered how these impacts varied based on the length of study's follow-up period. And then finally, one neat feature of a lot of evidence and gaps maps is that they can be interactive. So users can often click on a cell or an icon within a cell and see a list of studies that found a particular impact. So on this slide that I'm showing, the picture here, you can sort of see what I mean. By clicking on the circle, if this was on your computer, you would be able to see a list of studies that contributed to the evidence represented in that circle. And this is actually a feature that you'll see in our evidence and gaps map as well. Next slide. So for our review, we included studies that met 3 criteria. First, the study must have measured program impacts relative to a comparison group that was generated through random assignment or matched to the treatment group using a quasi-experimental design. Second, the study had to examine a program that served youth younger than 18. And third, the study must have examined an HMRE program rather than a teen pregnancy prevention or dating violence prevention program. These programs tend to cover some, but not all of the same topics as HMRE programs. Next slide. In total, we identified 15 impact studies of HMRE programs for youth. In terms of what the programs look like in these studies, 13 of the studies evaluated programs offered in schools, 1 evaluated a program offered at a day camp for high-risk youth, and 1 evaluated a community-based program for youth aging out of foster care. The length of the programs varied quite a bit. On the short end, the shortest program was 1 week long, all the way up to 1 full school year. And the most commonly used curricula were Relationship Smarts, including different versions of Relationship Smarts Plus, also Connections and Love Notes. In terms of study design, the sample sizes ranged from about 200 to 2,000 youth. And in addition, 9 of the studies measured outcomes immediately after the program, 3 measured outcomes less than a year after the program, and 6 measured outcomes a year or more after the program. And yes, I recognize that those numbers at the end there don't add up to 15. Some of the studies are counted more than once because they measured outcomes at multiple time points. And if you're interested in learning even more about the studies included in our review, we have a really nice table in the appendix of the report summarizing each of the studies. Next slide. To understand the impacts of this body of literature, we categorized outcomes into 8 outcome domains. We considered 5 of these outcomes core outcome domains because they are more central to the goals of HMRE programming. So these core domains included relationship attitudes and beliefs, openness to future relationship services, relationship skills, conflict management behaviors, and relationship quality with a romantic partner. And then we also considered 3 additional outcome domains that reflect concepts that are somewhat more tangential to the goals of HMRE programming. And these additional domains included sexual risk behaviors, knowledge and attitudes, personal well-being, and relationship quality with parents and friends. Next slide. All right, so this slide shows our completed evidence and gaps map for the core outcome domains. I'll walk us through key findings in a minute, but for now I just want to explain how to read the map. Like I said before, the map summarizes evidence on the impacts of HMRE programs for youth and how the impacts vary by the length of studies follow-up periods. The rows correspond to the core outcome domains, and the columns correspond to the time period of the follow-up measures, ranging from immediately after the program, so like a program exit survey, to a year or more after the baseline survey. In the cells, you can see 2 different color circles. The solid green circles denote studies that found a statistically significant favorable impact on an outcome at the specified time point, whereas the open gray circles denote studies that found no impact on an outcome at the specified time point. None of the studies that we reviewed found statistically significant unfavorable impacts. If they had, they would have been depicted with a red circle in the cells. And then the size of the circles reflects the strength of the evidence, with larger dots indicating a greater number of studies. So in other words, a big green circle indicates that several studies, maybe 5 or 6, found a favorable impact on a particular outcome domain, whereas a smaller green circle indicates that just 1 or 2 studies found a favorable impact in a particular outcome domain. Okay, next slide. Just to give you a better sense of what I mean, here is the same evidence and gaps map with the names of the studies in place of the circles. Basically, the green and gray circles on the prior slide represent the studies listed here. In the interactive version of the report, you can click on a cell that contains a circle and a text box would show up listing these studies represented by the circle. And the purpose of having the circles rather than listing out all of the studies like you see here is it provides a nice, clear, clean way of showing the strength of the evidence for impacts on a particular outcome. So if you see a big green circle, you know there's quite a bit of evidence suggesting that HMRE programs have a favorable impact on a particular outcome domain. Likewise, if you see a small circle, you know there's some evidence, but there's not as much. So with that, let me highlight 5 key findings from our evidence and gaps map. Next slide. All right. The first finding I want to highlight is that several of the studies we reviewed found favorable impacts immediately after the program on youth's relationship attitudes and beliefs, including their willingness to use relationship services in the future. So this is depicted in the top left cell and the cell right below it, and I've circled these cells in red on the map so you can see what I'm referring to. 7 of the 15 studies we reviewed found favorable impacts of HMRE programs on young people's relationship attitudes and beliefs immediately after the program. These included outcomes like how much youth value qualities like warmth and trustworthiness in a partner, and how much they disapprove of unhealthy relationship behaviors. In addition, 2 studies also found a favorable impact at program exit on youth's willingness to participate in future relationship education or couples counseling. Next slide. Our second key finding was that the evidence of impacts on youth's relationship skills and conflict management behaviors is mixed. So in the third and fourth rows of the map, you can see that we found a real mix of favorable and null impacts on these outcome domains. By relationship skills, we mean outcomes like respondents' self-reported abilities to do things like communicate effectively and understand other people's perspectives. And by conflict management behaviors, we mean respondents' self-reported use of healthy and unhealthy behaviors for managing conflict in an actual romantic relationship or in a friendship. If you're familiar with the conflict tactics scale, a lot of studies measured this outcome or outcomes in this domain using the conflict tactics scale. All right, next slide. Our third key finding was that relatively few studies examined impacts on the quality of romantic relationships. You can really see this in the final row of the map. Despite this being an important goal of youth HMRE programs, only 4 of the studies we reviewed included outcomes related to the quality of young people's romantic relationships. And I'll talk a little bit more about why this might be towards the end of the presentation. Of the 4 studies that looked at outcomes in this domain, only 1 of them found a favorable impact. This was a study of a program for pregnant and parenting youth, and they found a reduction in co-parenting conflict among youth who participated in the full HMRE program compared to those who participated in only part of the program. Next slide. All right. The next finding I want to highlight is that there is limited evidence of longer-term impacts of HMRE programs for youth, particularly for studies with higher response rates. The third column of the map shows studies that examined outcomes 1 year or more after the program. And you can see from the mix of green and gray circles that these studies found a mix of favorable and null impacts. However, one thing you can't see in the map is that most of the studies that found favorable impacts had response rates of less than 25% on the follow-up surveys. These low response rates raise the possibility that the kinds of students, young people who responded to the survey may not be the same in the treatment and comparison groups, and therefore that the impact estimates might be biased or unreliable. The studies that had response rates above 75% generally found no evidence of impacts on these outcomes, and we have a lot more confidence in these findings. All right, next slide. Finally, our 5th key finding focuses on the additional outcome domains of sexual risk behaviors, knowledge and attitudes, personal well-being, and relationship quality with parents and friends. In general, we found limited evidence that HMRE programs affected outcomes in these domains. There weren't a ton of studies that included outcomes in these domains, and most of the studies that did examine these outcomes found null impacts. Next slide. All right, so in sum, this work summarized what we know and don't yet know about the impacts of HMRE programs for youth and points to some important topics for future research. One such direction for future research would be to help identify new program delivery models that strengthen programs' long-term impacts on young people's relationship attitudes and beliefs. We found good evidence that HMRE programs can have favorable impacts on these outcomes around the time the program ends, but several high-quality studies generally found no evidence of impact on these outcomes a year or more after the program. To increase the likelihood of longer-term impacts, program providers may need to consider certain adaptations, such as offering longer programs. I know that might sound like a ridiculous proposition to people who are familiar with working in schools. However, programs could consider increasing their dosage to offer more content. But obviously in schools, this is really challenging. It's already difficult to find time to deliver any sort of extra programming in a school context. Another option that might be a bit more feasible could be to sequence programming across multiple grade levels. For instance, if students attend an HMRE program in 9th grade, providers could consider offering booster sessions later in high school to help reinforce key skills and concepts from the program. Another adaptation could be to offer programs later in adolescence, when youth are more likely to be in romantic relationships and may find program content a bit more relevant. For any of these ideas, formative research could be useful for identifying promising new program models. Next slide. A second implication for future research is that we still don't know much about the impacts of HMRE programs for youth on the quality of young people's current and future relationships. To learn more about this, researchers may need to assess outcomes when youth are older and have more dating experience. Most of the youth in the studies we reviewed were not in romantic relationships, and this limits the ability of programs to influence outcomes related to the quality of young people's romantic relationships, as well as the ability of studies to assess these outcomes. Given that the ultimate goal of HMRE programs for youth is to improve the quality of participants' relationships, it will be important for researchers to design studies that can provide a better test of these outcomes. In addition, studies should consider a broader array of outcomes related to relationship quality, including exposure to dating violence or sexual harassment. Reducing young people's exposure to these negative relationship experiences is an important goal of HMRE programs, but notably none of the studies we reviewed examined these outcomes. Next slide. Finally, a third implication is that more research is needed to understand the impacts of HMRE programs offered outside of schools and to particular subgroups of youth who may be at higher risk of negative relationship outcomes. As I mentioned earlier, almost all of the studies we reviewed examined the effectiveness of HMRE programs offered in high schools to a general school population of youth. However, there are many HMRE programs that serve kids outside of schools, as I noted earlier, and these programs often work with particularly disadvantaged groups, such as youth who are pregnant or parenting, or youth who are enrolled in the child welfare system. But very few impact studies have looked at these programs, perhaps because such programs tend to be smaller or don't have the infrastructure or capacity to support a high quality impact study. More work needs to be done to understand how HMRE programs support the healthy relationship development of high-risk youth. All right, next slide. So if you're interested in viewing the full evidence in gaps map, this is a link to where it's located on ACF's website, but I believe you can also download it, as I mentioned, from the webinar platform. I think it's linked as a handout. And then I've included my email address on this slide in case anyone wants to reach out after the presentation with questions about either this study or about the framing research project in general. Next slide. All right, so with that, happy to open it up for questions.
So thank you, Julia. That was wonderful. You so well described the challenges we face in the field, right? So how do you get to young people for a certain length of time? How do you find them enough later to really see if your program made a difference down the road. So these are all really good questions. So I believe all the states, one person asked, Lisa asked, if the full citations, are they in the report that are on the control panel?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, please open up that report. You can see all of the citations. You can read kind of a brief third of a page summary of each of the studies that we reviewed, but then there's citations so you can go and access the full study as well.
And if those of you out there in webinar land know about studies in the gray literature or formally published studies that we don't know about, you think we don't know about, please send them, because all the time we're finding that people are studying healthy relationships programs. They don't check in with us for sure, and then it's studied. So we'd love to have that included. Okay, Julia, another question from Jake asked, and this was when you were describing the core components of the program and not the core components, and you said sexual behavior was not considered a core component. For the purposes of this study, an HMRE study, why weren't sexual behaviors considered core components?
Yeah, that's a nice question. So I think a lot of HMRE programs do include content on sexual risk behaviors, teen pregnancy prevention, et cetera. But some don't. And we really wanted to limit the core outcome domains to the kind of central topics that are, kind of at the core of what HMRE programs are trying to do. So not all of the studies looked at outcomes related to sexual risk behaviors, knowledge, and attitudes. A few did. So we wanted to make sure that we incorporated the research that was out there on those outcomes. But for the reasons I just mentioned, we didn't consider it core. We considered it additional.
Right. I mean, I remember way back when we didn't have any sexual materials in Dibble materials. It was just our whole theory of change was just all built on relationships. And we've since changed, and we have contraception and planning and pacing or waiting or whatever, whatever flavor you like, that works in your community. But there's so much richness in teaching young people just the skills around relationships. So Julia, perhaps I could also answer this, but I'm curious, in the studies that you evaluated, were any of them used in or evaluated in health classes, in high school health classes?
Yes, absolutely. I'd have to look back at our appendix to see how many, but one of the studies that I conducted that you mentioned in your intro, okay, that was in high school health classes, the program in Georgia.
So for those of you who don't know about getting into high schools, health is a great doorway if you want to bring programming in, or if you're a teacher. And every class in America has something called a framework. So there's a framework for Algebra 2, there's a framework for, sophomore English, and there's a framework for health. So all of our programs are crosswalked to these frameworks. The frameworks tell the teacher what they need to teach. So what we've done is show them, well, if you teach this program, you're hitting these parts. So then it's easier to tell a teacher, I'd like to come into your class and run a program, and I can help you accomplish what you're supposed to accomplish. They'll run you around the room on their shoulders. So yeah, it's used in health classes. In some jurisdictions, family consumer sciences have classes like on family dynamics, team living. Those are probably the two most common. There are other places in high schools. Oh my gosh, questions just keep coming. How do I access these programs? Dibbleinstitute.org there are multiple people publishing programs. So I can only speak about Dibbles. So the Dibble Institute programs, evidence-based programs, dibbleinstitute.org, and sign up on our newsletter. If you got this invitation to this webinar from a friend who loves you and they sent you here, thank them for us, and then sign up yourself. And then if you have other questions, you can call our 800 number and we'd be happy to yak with you about, because there's different circumstances, different kinds of young people. We want to make sure you get a program that really meets the needs of your young people. It seems if we started HMRE in middle school and follow up in high school, it would help with impacts for outcomes and interests. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the more the merrier. The reality is that like HMRE funding doesn't go into middle schools. So that's just a quirk of Congress, and so it's only for high school youth. They don't let you count the same child twice. So if you did it as a freshman and did it as a senior, you couldn't do that. So but if you were independent of federal funding, there's certainly ways you could do a continuum of care, a continuum, and there are programs that start for younger people and then are reinforced. And as Julia said, where it really sticks is if you're 16, 17, 18, and your brain is starting to mature a little bit, and you're thinking, oh, I have a future. Life's coming at me. I'm starting to see these relationships really develop. I mean, it's a brilliant time to do relationship education when young people are just about ready to fly out of high school. Okay. How can we access relationship smarts, connections, and love notes on the website? Yes, indeed. On the Dibble website, dibblinstitute.org, under our programs are all those programs. We're just coming up. We're just updating both Love Notes and Relationship Smarts Plus. They'll be in the warehouse like in 2 weeks. And so stay tuned. We'll put you on our distribution list of people that will get that announcement. And we have online free review copies you can look at. There's sample lessons. We want to help you make a really good decision. Does this HMRE funding support middle school youth? No, sadly. You can't argue that a rising 8th grader could be considered a 9th grader, but really not any longer. Relationship education, however, can be used as an intervention in pregnancy prevention programs and sexual risk avoidance programs. So we see people using different funding down to younger youth. And, I could talk about this all day long. I love it. So, call me. So, Julia, for you, can you tell us more about one study on parenting youth? What are the barriers and opportunities to include teen parents in early home visiting programs? 40,000, whoever wrote this, Queen really knows their stuff. 40,000 births in the United States where the mother's 15 to 17 years old. I would like to follow up with you on my paper on 63 teen moms, 15-year-old, using within my reach to prevent teen dating violence. Well, that sounds super interesting. So we can link you up with King, but can you tell us any more about that pregnant and parenting study?
Yeah, absolutely. This was an impact study that came out of the last round of grant funding. They were funded in the 2015 cohort, and I don't want to go into too much detail because I don't want to get it wrong, but this was a study conducted out of Texas. The researchers, I believe, were at Texas State University, and they brought relationship education programming. I don't remember which curriculum, maybe Love Notes, to teen parents. It was offered at a school, but it was a class particularly for teen parents. And then they had the Love Notes curriculum and like a modified version of Family Expectations, which is like a parenting, co-parenting curriculum as well. So they delivered both of those curricula in a combined program to parents. Very interesting study, very interesting service population, a little difficult to tease out the impacts of like the particular curricula since they offered both to the students. They also had a control group that didn't get any, and then they had control groups that got some, but not others. Very interesting study. So happy to connect after this presentation and talk more about that.
Yeah, we will connect you for sure. I'm interested in learning that as well. I was just actually on that group's website this morning, and they use Love Notes. And I'm not sure that we have the most recent study. So again, call out to all of you who are listening. If you know a study, send it to us. We love it. Which programs were included in the study? What Julia looked for was already existing studies and wasn't conducting her own original research. So our experience is, people, graduate students, PhDs, people just pick programs they like, they think are going to fit their populations, and they do it. So you weren't at all selecting, Julia, for programming. You just, if it was a healthy relationship program, that's what you studied in the study.
Correct. Yeah, we did our best to find all the studies we could. As part of the 2015 round of grant funding, the programs were supposed to conduct an impact study. That was one of the conditions of their grant funding. Right. And so for any HMRE programs for youth that successfully completed an impact study, we looked at their studies. Right. We looked at studies that were published much earlier, like in the early 2000s, before federal funding for these programs was even available. So yeah, we tried to find all we could. There's probably some studies we missed, like with any
Right.
review.
You cast the wide net. Okay, so how much does this cost? You know, this isn't meant to be a sales time, but since you asked, you know, generally programs are between like $400 and $500, and you get 12 lessons and all the activity cards and the treasure chest in the sky, which has PowerPoints and masters and everything you need to get your program up and running. And again, dibblelinstitute.org, our programs will get you there. Homeschoolers often benefit from these programs. More studies for homeschoolers. Yeah, that'd be awesome. You know, I've looked at the homeschooling world. The inherent issue with homeschoolers is it's hard to find enough of them for a study. I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe there's a way to do that. And Elaine, if you have an idea, you know, be happy to chit chat about that. My sense is that, you know, when you need 500 kids, it's, you know, or even 200, it's difficult. I do parenting classes for teen moms. How can I apply this? You know, Love Notes, our program was written specifically for young adults and young parents. If you go to again, let me just say this, dibblelinstitute.org, free resources, webinars. Last month, we had the director of DAPI, Delaware Adolescent Parent Incorporated, who uses Love Notes with her youth, and it's used extensively. Like Julie just said, there's a program down in Texas State, I think it is, in San Marcos. So it's used a lot. And again, we'd be happy to send you a review copy to take a look, because young moms and dads have special issue. You know, that you really, you know, you can Google bad things dads do, and you get some, you know, things. If you do bad things boyfriends do, oh my gosh. So helping young people understand how to form safe, stable, and healthy families moving forward, and how to keep their kids safe. A lot of people are using our programs with child abuse prevention and targeting teen moms. So it's a good thing to be looking at. HMRE in prisons, youth detention, young adults, etc. Absolutely. We see our clients in those settings: residential care, youth in care, corrections. You know, they have their own issues, like you can't take staples into a locked facility because, you know, kids can hurt each other with a staple. I mean, I'm not being funny. That's true. So we actually have case studies. If I go to, again, dibblelinstitute.org, case study, free resources, case studies. We try to group client stories based on where they're doing their work or which program they're using. So under youth corrections, I'm not sure if it's under youth corrections or juvenile justice, but absolutely. We just got a call this week from Communities in School in North Carolina, a county group that their DA had asked them to start doing programming with their youth in care. And so, you know, it's a big need. And if you can step into that breach, you know, please do, and call me, because I love to talk about it. Team homeschoolers, right? Well, Elaine, call me, 800-695-7975, extension 700, and let's talk about homeschoolers, because I don't know much about it. Has this been used in incarcerated system? I think you're meaning incarcerated. Yes, I don't, Julia, your studies haven't involved incarcerated youth, right?
No, they have not.
Yeah. Doing studies in incarcerated settings and juvenile justice settings is hard. This isn't to say the work isn't being done, but it's probably not being studied. What I've learned is when you're a ward of the court and your parent is the DA or the public defender, you know, they're very protective, and they may not give you access to those young people. So I'm not saying it shouldn't be done. It's just that it's not studied very, very much. And again, dibblelinstitute.org, free resources, case studies, and you'll see the places that we found. And if you would like a case study, if you're using one of our programs in an amazing place, we'd love to talk about you, because just like these questions, there's so many places you can stick relationship education. And, you know, Julia's doing it, and God love her, by the book, like, what did the data say? But we also know there's plenty of people who are out in the field and saying, I'm seeing this make a difference. You know, I see it make a difference with kids every day. And we honor that as well. I mean, it's of course not the same as a peer-reviewed study, for sure, but you know, we have common sense. So yeah, it's a great place to put youth relationship education. All righty. Well, after all of that, oh, here's more pornography. Uh, okay, so I look forward to getting more information concerning love notes. You know, email me, kreed@dibblesinstitute.org. I'll spell it out, Kayreed. I think my email's coming up, and we'll get you a copy of the new love notes. So pornography in these programs, youth exposed, you know, sadly, pornography is often the only sex education that some kids get. And so they, you know, and so that's where they flaw. I mean, there's many reasons. We cover pornography and online, you know, what do they call that? Sextortion, online porn in our programs, because it's an important topic in these days. So we do cover it. I missed the slides. How do you get the presentation? Well, woohoo, dibblesinstitute.org. Repeat after me. Free resources, webinars. We will archive this, and we will send you an email when it's archived. It'll be archived. Oh, my trusty friend is there moving me along. It'll be there in the next 3 days, and then you can share it with your friends, and it'll be there forever. And we'll also put up the report that accompanied this, and we can also make PDFs of the slides. Oh my gosh, we keep going here. How about program impacts on alcohol, drug abuse, self-harm, ideation, and depression? I have an answer, but you first, Julia.
Yeah, so I don't remember if all of those were included, but certainly depression, stress were two of the outcomes in the personal well-being category. That was sort of our miscellaneous category. I don't recall if any of the studies looked at alcohol use, or I'm almost positive none of them looked at self-harm. But I would say go look at the report, the appendix to the report, and you can find the particular studies that examined those outcomes.
Yeah, so the unofficial answer, you know, not from the researcher, but from me, is that when you think about a theory of change and how young people gain agency and they learn how to communicate and they learn how to look at pros and cons, they learn how to plan, it should, not the same as does, should have an impact on those outcomes. We know, so for instance, we have a client who's doing a recovery program and using love notes as the intervention, and with SAMHSA funding. So that's really, really interesting. Depression, you know, the #1 reason young people commit suicide is a failed romantic relationship. So, you know, we think it can help. And programs impacts on LGBTQ youth. I don't know that I've seen any studies specifically on HMRE studies and LGBTQ youth, but I will tell you, we write it to be inclusive, and our programs are being used with LGBTQ youth. And so we, you know, we can always do better at all these things for sure. But we've gone through and really carefully, like, looked at names, looked at images, looked at scenarios. Some of our scenarios are specifically for LGBTQ youth. So we know, because, and the other part is, if you're looking at those, let's say 60 eyes, those 30 sets of eyes in a health class, you don't know who's in the room, you know? So you have to be, you know, at least in my mind, respectful and welcoming to everybody who's in that room. And that's why we write to fit the broadest possible thing. Okay, next slide, Esther. We're going to keep going. This is super fun. Okay, Esther, next slide. So stay in touch. I told you, you know, dibblesinstitute.org a zillion times. And we're also on Facebook. We're on LinkedIn. You know, call us, whatever. We're happy to hear from you. Okay, next slide. And next month, right, John Lewis, he's actually doing work in incarcerated settings in Los Angeles, is going to speak on how to engage young men in adolescent pregnancy prevention programming. He's a wonderful speaker, really funny guy, and you guys will learn a lot. So we'll have that up in the next couple of days, and register, you know. It'd be fun to see you again for our 114th webinar. All righty, so if there's no further questions, looks like, oh, would like to see youth write reflective books and programs on this topic. Right, so our programs have journals that allow kids to think and reflect and, you know, like, do their thing. But to your point, Elaine, that's a, you know, a super way to have young people change. Okay, so I'm running out of time. Julia, my heartfelt thanks. Thank you. Thank you to all of you who attended. And we'll see you in November, second Wednesday, 1 o'clock Pacific. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.